Hey everyone, Logan here, and welcome back to the History of Sega miniseries. I took a few weeks off and now I'm ready to get back to it. So today, let's talk about one of my favorite and most nostalgic consoles of all time, the Sega Genesis. So without further ado, let's get started. As stated in my Master System video, the Sega Master System didn't sell well in the US and only had moderate success in everywhere else other than Brazil and in parts of Europe. Sega higher-ups saw this as a problem and came up with a plan to combat it. Sega had long been considered the poor man's Nintendo. Their plan to get rid of that notion was to release the first 16-bit system and do a hard advertising campaign. The advertisements were going to say that they were the older and more mature system and that Nintendo was for little kids. This plan worked quite well because at the time, the majority of consumers thought that the more powerful system equals the better system. Also, what kid wants to buy a system that has a reputation of being for kids? A good example of this is that the Wii U marketed itself towards kids. Young kids usually want to play what the older kids are playing, and like I said, the older kids are turned off. So, it literally appealed to nobody, and the same thing is what they're trying to go for here. But we're getting ahead of ourselves and a bit off topic, so back to the Genesis. The system was developed under the codename Sega Mark V, and for much of its life, it was intended to be another 8-bit system built on top of the existing Master System. Software developers got little to no say on what they wanted with the system, with Sega instead pushing to make the graphics as good as possible. The console also had a very distinct music chip with a nice sounding twang to it. These decisions are reflected with the system eventually being upgraded to a 16-bit system to accommodate them. The system first released in Japan on October 19, 1988 as the Sega Mega Drive. This name comes from President Hayao Nakayama, who clarified that Mega stood for superiority over other systems, and Drive comes from the Motorola 68000 processor that powers it. Despite the TurboGrafx 16 having a 16-bit graphics card, the Sega Mega Drive was the first console to be a true 16-bit system. Sega even plastered 16-bit on the front of the system, in an action that some believe is the beginning of the Bit Wars, which was where companies would advertise their console by saying it had more bits and was therefore a better system. Unfortunately, as with the Master System before it, the Mega Drive just did okay in Japan, being dominated by the TurboGrafx 16 and the Famicom. Regardless of this failure, plans were made to ship the system worldwide. On August 14, 1989, the Mega Drive came over to America as the Sega Genesis. While Sega initially planned for the Mega Drive to have the same name in all regions, the name Mega Drive was already copyrighted in North America by a company named Mega Drive Systems, so they had to change it. David Rosen originally tried to get the Atari Corporation to distribute the console due to Tonka doing poorly with the Master System, as well as getting a chance to jab at Nintendo for failing at a similar partnership with the NES a few years prior. The deal fell through, however, and it was decided that Sega of America would handle the distribution and marketing of the console in North America. When the Genesis first launched in North America, Sega of America, headed by CEO Michael Katz, focused on several sports and arcade games while making several celebrity endorsements, such as Michael Jackson's Moonwalker. They also made deals with Disney to make games for their system, as well as making a great working relationship with EA that would last for many years. By the end of the 80s, the Genesis did quite well in North America, but was still not able to topple Nintendo. In response, Sega hired Tom Kalinske to replace Walt as CEO in 1990. Kalinske was already famous for making the Barbie toy line massively successful, and Sega thought that was exactly what they needed. In addition to this, they decided they needed a new killer mascot to drive sales. I'll be covering this part in more detail in next week's video, but basically, Sega held a company-wide competition for a new mascot, among those being a hedgehog drawn on a napkin by Naoto Oshima. After undergoing a few changes, the character became Sonic the Hedgehog and was released for the Genesis in 1991. Under Kalinske's direction, the Genesis would go through a renaissance, going from moderately successful to a massive success. Kalinske made a 4-point plan: cut the price of the Genesis, create a game development department in North America that would make games that would appeal to Americans, continue the hard advertising campaign that they have been doing so far, and then replace the current pack-and-game Altered Beast with Sonic the Hedgehog. Sega of Japan was initially skeptical about the plan, thinking it was crazy to be basically giving away the consoles. However, President Hayao Nakayama had faith in him and let him proceed. It turned out to be a successful gamble, as for the first time since December of 1985, Nintendo was behind on the market share, with Sega having 65%. In 1992, the Sega Genesis was the #1 selling Christmas toy, and Sonic the Hedgehog 2 was the best-selling game. In 1993, they would take it a step further by starting a blast processing ad campaign. Like previous ads, this was to make it sound like the Super Nintendo was a weaker and slower system, and that Sega could deliver the smooth gameplay that they claimed Nintendo couldn't. This was just marketing fluff, however, because blast processing didn't really affect the console's capabilities. All of these hard advertising campaigns eventually became known as the Console Wars, and marks one of the toughest competitions in video game history. Before we move on, this is the Sega Genesis Model 1. It's the only one I have right now, but I really wanted to show it off because it basically shows everything Sega was trying to do in the 90s, and it's probably the best version anyways, and I just thought it was important to show, the actual console itself since I'm doing a video over it. And the reason I'm doing it this part of the video is because I literally couldn't find anywhere else to do it. So anyways, at the top of the system, there's the cartridge slot, and that's obviously where the cartridges go, but you can also plug in a 32-bit adapter and the power base converter. On the left side of the system, there's a reset button, power switch, and a volume slider. In the center of the system, there's a red light that lets you know when the power is on. On the right side of the system, there's a dust cover, and when removed, it reveals the expansion port which allows you to plug in a Sega CD. On the back of the system, there's all the options to plug up to the TV. There's the AC adapter, the RF switch, the AC plug, and then there's also the channel switch. There's channels 3 and 4 that you can choose, but obviously you only use the channel switch for RF. On the front of the system, there's a headphone jack, and on the right front of the system are the controller ports. And actually, it's pretty interesting that the Genesis can take all Genesis controllers, Master System controllers, and strangely, it can also accept Atari controllers. This is because the plug of the Atari is the exact same as the Genesis. And that's about all for the design, so let's get back to the rest of the video. Meanwhile, in Japan, Sega's technical engineers were hard at work making accessories for the system. In 1989, they released the Power Base Converter. This add-on was placed on top of your Model 1 Genesis and allowed you to play almost every Sega Master System game. This gave Sega an edge with parents who were upset that the Super Nintendo didn't have backwards compatibility with the NES. Something that must be extremely annoying for consumers back in the console's heyday was that some games required you to use a Master System controller to play. Luckily, the two controllers' pin connectors were the same, and no adapters were needed to plug one in. The problem is, stores were not selling Master System controllers at the time, which meant they had to contact Sega themselves just to get a controller. Yikes. In 1991, they created an add-on for the Mega Drive called the Mega CD. The add-on sported an extra processor and RAM, as well as being able to run games off a compact disc. This add-on was localized as the Sega CD, and contrary to popular belief, it actually didn't do too bad. The add-on sold 2.2 million units, and that may sound low, but think of it this way. It was a $300 add-on that required a second system to even use. 2.24 million isn't half bad in my opinion. In 1993, Sega released the Mega Drive 2, which was a redesigned version of the Mega Drive. It was meant to be smaller and remove unnecessary features such as the headphone jack. Along with this, they also released the Mega CD 2, which was made to accommodate the Model 2's design, while also working with the original model. Due to being a top-loading CD tray this time around, it was way less prone to hardware failure, which is a plus. While I do think the Model 1 Mega CD looks way cooler, the Model 2 is worth it if you're thinking about picking one up for the reliability alone. Actually, Sega released an all-in-one unit called the Sega CDX. Unfortunately, this model is known for having an easily failing laser. Both came over to the States as the Genesis, without the Sega part, and the Sega CD Model 2. Because having the names Sega Genesis and just Genesis for different models is confusing, the Mega Drive 2 is informally known as the Sega Genesis Model 2 over in the States. One downside with the Model 2 is that the power base converter will only work if you cut the tab out of the back of the converter, or else the video cords will get blocked. Europe fixed this problem, however, by releasing a second version of the device called the Master System Converter 2. Sega also released a few portable versions of the Mega Drive. The Mega Jet was released in 1994 for airlines. It was screenless and it had a controller built in. All the customer had to do was plug in the video cables and they were good to go. Sega eventually made this a consumer product in Japan. Another portable was known as the Sega Nomad. The Nomad was a full-on portable, similar in size to the Sega Game Gear. And it also had a nice D-pad, a backlit screen, and accepts nearly any cartridge the Genesis does. As to be expected from handhelds, neither supports the Genesis add-ons like the Mega CD and the 32X. Both didn't sell very well, and they've mostly become collector pieces these days. Back in America, Sega was on top of the world after continuing their success with games such as the multi-cartridge game Sonic the Hedgehog 3 and Knuckles, and the superior sports titles on the system, such as Madden 94. 1994 also saw the launch of the Sega's Channel service, allowing customers to download Genesis games through their unique cable television service. It was in some ways an early form of online gaming. It was actually quite successful, lasting until the summer of 1998. By 1994, 18 million Genesis units were sold. But unfortunately, this is where Sega's hardware business's downfall started. Sega of Japan ordered Sega of America to make an add-on for the Sega Genesis that gave it 32-bit graphics. Sega of Japan claimed it was to bridge the gap in the market share. Sega of America argued that there was no gap to be bridged, but they started on the project anyways. Codenamed Project Mars, it was yet another attempt by Sega to lengthen the life of the Genesis. The result was the Sega 32X, launching on November 21st, 1994 in North America, with the Japan launch happening about a month later. Prior to the launch, Sega of America sank millions of dollars into advertising the system, with campaigns having very suggestive and mature themes. Initially, the Sega 32X was widely successful, with orders far outweighing the supply. In fact, there were plans in making an all-in-one Genesis 32X system, which was codenamed the Sega Neptune. But by 1995, this was cancelled, and the Genesis as well as the 32X's sales suddenly started dropping off. So, what went wrong? Well, a number of things. For one, Nintendo was still around, and on the same day as the 32X's launch, they released Donkey Kong Country, a highly impressive game at the time for its pre-rendered graphics, and their advertisements even struck at Sega by saying that no CD or 32-bit adapters were required. This seriously cut into Sega's sales and credibility. Some Sega employees even thought that another $200 adapter made them seem like a greedy corporation. An additional blow was that the 32X's titles were either buggy or unimpressive. Without a big system seller, there was little to no incentive to buy a 32X. It got so bad that some places even discounted the console to a measly $20. For the Genesis itself, it died in a more interesting way. First off, they were approached by Sony to make a CD-based add-on for the Genesis. This is because Nintendo had recently betrayed Sony with a similar proposal in order to work with their rival Philips instead. We all know how that went. Anyways, Tom Kalinske wanted to do the partnership because they believed that they could make a great working relationship with Sony. Sega of Japan instead said, and I quote, "That's a stupid idea. Sony doesn't know how to make hardware. They don't know how to make software either. Why would we want to do this?" End quote. After this, Sony went and made hardware, and then they went and made software, and then they went and became the #1 console manufacturer in the world. Good one, guys! Sega of America and Sega of Japan did this a lot. They both strongly disagreed on multiple ideas. The rivalry literally led to the downfall of Sega. I didn't mention this earlier, but the Genesis and 32X's main downfall was from Sega of Japan. While Sega of America was sinking millions of dollars into 32X advertisements, Sega of Japan was quietly developing their own next-generation 32-bit console, the Sega Saturn. The Saturn was announced during the 32X's development and launched in Japan a day after the 32X. This effectively killed the Genesis, which was still going strong in North America at this point, and it made the company lose millions of dollars. It didn't help that the Sega Saturn's launch was notoriously bad. Adding all these factors up basically killed Sega. It's a real shame that the Genesis had to die in such bad circumstances, but I know it would be forever one of the most fondly remembered consoles of all time. In fact, it has been re-released various times under Sega's license. Majesco released a version of the Genesis in 1998 known as the Genesis 3. The Genesis 3 fixed several bugs, but broke some games that actually utilized the bugs. It also didn't work with the power-based converter, Sega CD, and the 32X. Unless you're a collector, I would stay away from this one. Another company named At Games releases an emulated version of the Genesis yearly. These are infamous for poor sound and emulation quality. Even if you are a collector, please do yourself a favor and don't bother with this one. The last thing I have is, if you're thinking about buying a Genesis, I would recommend the Model 1. It's the best version in my opinion, and it works with every accessory. But be aware that there are multiple versions of the Model 1. Depending on the release date, there are different qualities of the sound and video, and if you want to use ROM hacks on your console, Make sure you get a unit that doesn't show a licensed by Sega boot up screen, or they will not work. For more information on these variations, I recommend visiting thegametrog.com/Sega Genesis 123 information specs. Links in the description, and because frankly, they understand this way better than I do. And that is about all I have on the Genesis. I really hope you've been enjoying the series as much as I love making it, and you should expect parts 4 and 5 to come out either late this month or early next month. Thank you guys so much for watching, and with that, I'll leave you with footage of some of the best and most influential Genesis games in my opinion. Goodbye. Hey everyone, thank you for making it to the end. I know I missed some must-haves like Comic Zone and Echo the Dolphin, but I had no means to record them, nor the time right now. So, thank you for watching again, and I'll see you guys next week. Goodbye.